Hi people. Today I'm going to do a little video introducing the topic of last week, affects plural. It is the third and final installment of our unit on embodied spectatorship. Remember that spectatorship is a broad field of contemporary film theory, and embodied spectatorship is something of a subfield, a turn toward the body in general. What do I mean by affects plural? Kind of an opaque way to talk about something that we're all familiar with, which is emotions. The reason I'm calling it affects plural is because when people like in this book, Cyan Nye, in her book Ugly Feelings, or Sarah Ahmed in her book Cultural Politics of Emotion, when folks like this in the humanities started to write these book-length studies of emotions, that general trend in the late 90s and mostly during the 2000s was called the affective turn. So it was part of the general interest in affect. So that's why I say affective turn, or why I say affects plural, is just so you understand this turn toward named emotions is generally understood as part of this turn toward feeling in general, right? And then you might have someone most recently like Eugenie Brinkema, who's taking the general interest in affect and emotion in the humanities and applying it to film. Her book, once again, is a kind of polemic against the way in which affect studies works. I'm not going to discuss the polemic because it's very, very complicated to do. So just check out chapter headings for this book and you'll get a similar sense of named emotions. Like, what is the logic of anxiety, right? What is the logic of disgust? What is the logic of hate? These are the questions that guide this subset of affect studies I'm calling affects plural, right? It's not just the idea of affect as distinct from emotion, this unformed pre-personal intensity that comes before emotion. It's understanding what these emotions are, sometimes in the realm of politics, sometimes in the realm of philosophy, like what are they, what is their nature, or phenomenology. What is it like, very specifically, to feel that emotion as opposed to this emotion? What does it look like to describe the experience of that emotion? That's the stuff that we're dealing with. And you might think the most familiar approach to this question would come from psychology, right? If any of you have taken a psychology class, you might remember a series of images like this one. Psychologists, or psychology as a field, tends to be interested in aspiring to the universal, right? So it became very attractive for psychology to kind of list what the emotions are as almost cross-cultural, pseudo-universal things. I think for Paul Ekman, who is attributed with naming the 6 basic emotions, there's this aspiration that anyone or almost anyone across the world can look at these faces and identify in their own language or with their own conceptual schema what are the emotions being represented here. And I'm sure all of you can do the same thing. Emotions like these are so understood that you can make characters out of them. You can make these personifications of them, and it becomes a rather appealing way of organizing a narrative structure. Interestingly, they took the 6 basic emotions from Ekman and they subtracted one, which I think is the one that we have the hardest time personifying, which is surprise. I want us to focus on one particular emotion, and that is disgust. Now, if we were to discuss disgust from a philosophical or maybe from a cognitive, scientific, or psychological point of view, the first things you might note are the ways in which disgusted faces have similar characteristics, and those characteristics can tell us a little bit about what the nature of that emotion is. So notice all the ways in which the eyes get close to closing in a disgusted face. The nose kind of scrunches up as if maybe it's trying to block the passageway of air into the nose, like the stuff that smells bad. You know, when things smell bad, it makes sense that our disgusted reaction would constrict the nasal passageway. And the way that the mouth will either shrink up or almost gag out, like the tongue going out or the mouth kind of curling upward. These are things that psychologists would be interested in as establishing the idea that disgust is a semi-universal kind of emotion that occurs across cultures. So as you might have noted, Eugenie Brinkema's essay on disgust, her article on disgust, and the movie we watched, Cook the Thief, His Wife, Her Lover, it feels as much like it's doing philosophy, that is making large and complicated claims about the nature of disgust, as it is making critical claims about the film. Let's take this question, why do we feel disgust? That is a philosophical question, as it's probing the nature of this thing that we all recognize as a concept that we live with, which is disgust. Now, what's important to understand is that we can take a number of different fields that would answer this question differently. I imagine that the most intuitive and learned answer to this question would come from evolutionary biology. And evolutionary biology is maybe one of the most influential ways of thinking about everything that permeates our minds, even if we're not aware of it, right? What would an evolutionary biologist say about disgust? Why do we feel it? All right, the answer is it's poison protection. That makes a lot of sense. Why do we feel disgust? Well, maybe because we feel a disgusting reaction to the kinds of things that would harm us if we ingested them. It is true, a lot of disgusting things are not good for us. Say, if I were to ingest somebody else's feces or my own feces, that's generally considered a waste product and not really that good to ingest large quantities of. And so that's the reason evolutionary biologists might say that I feel a disgusted reaction to it. Okay, problem solved, we know why we have disgust. Well, of course, you realize that that doesn't cover everything. There are plenty of things that we feel disgusted at that might not be poisonous. The biologist might justify this by finding some kind of connection between the poisonous properties and the things that aren't poisonous. But nevertheless, it's a theory that is satisfying in some respects, but not in others. So let's take a different tack. Let's consider a cultural anthropologist. What would a culturalist generally, someone who cares about cultural specificity and the constructed nature of experience and perception, think about this? Well, one major figure is this person named Mary Douglas, who has a book called Purity and Danger, which is all about kind of developing a theory of disgust and dirtiness, like the kind of the tension between dirtiness and cleanliness, which she thinks are, as you can imagine, very central to many, many societies and civilizations, what we consider dirty. And for her, it was really interesting to discover that what people considered dirty was not at all the same across cultures. And so she would also say that what people considered disgusting was not the same across cultures. But there was a kind of pattern for the criteria that seemed to be used within those cultures, given their meanings and given their concepts. And the idea for her was that things that are disgusting are also things that blur categories. What do I mean by this? I'll give you a few examples. And by the way, if you're not satisfied by these examples, good. I'm not satisfied by them either. But you should know how certain individuals, how certain thinkers from particular fields would answer this puzzle of why things disgust us. So she would say that certain cultures don't eat frogs, and indeed there are certain cultures that just don't put frogs on the menu because frogs are amphibious animals and they trouble the comfortable boundary between some foods being seafoods and some foods being land foods, right? Your surf and your turf. And she would say that you have to find the kind of rigidity of those categories in a culture's understanding of cuisine to justify their exclusion of frogs from the menu. We know this is not the case for, say, French cuisine, for example. But that's her theory for why certain things might not be eaten. Maybe they blur a kind of comfortable category distinction. And she actually spends a long time with Jewish kosher laws. She says something like shellfish is considered not an okay thing to eat in certain cultures because it is ocean dwelling but doesn't swim. Like there's something different about the sea creature that a shellfish is that seems to violate a category distinction. Now, she's not interpreting Jewish law here. She's making a kind of hypothetical speculative conjecture about the underlying conditions of that law. Like, really, like, what is going on in people's minds who construct these? Or say, why are a lot of us creeped out or disgusted by cockroaches or various kinds of critters that enter our homes? Well, maybe it's because we are uncomfortable with the idea of the indoor and the outdoor being violated, right? So maybe we're okay with encountering critters that keep themselves outside, but we are uncomfortable once we see critter-like creatures entering our own home, thereby the indoor-outdoor binary, which is so important and strong for understanding what civilization is, thereby that is blurred in some uncomfortable way. So that's in a nutshell, a kind of a reductive account, but still a general account of that theory. And frankly, this theory has been influential on at least one major film scholar whose name is Noel Carroll. Now, Noel Carroll is a film scholar who is indebted to analytic philosophy, and he writes this book on the philosophy of horror, where he tries to figure out what is it that scares us in horror films? What is the nature of a horror film's monster? And what is the nature of the paradox of wanting to go to the movies to experience pleasure from unpleasurable emotions like fear and disgust? Now, I won't go into that, but it's important just to note that he borrows Mary Douglas's account of disgust and says that monsters in horror films are the kinds of things that blur categories, and thus they disgust us. So this actually can shed some insight on a lot of the monsters that we're most familiar with from canonical universal picture horror films, things like vampires, right? They are both living and they are dead. The same thing can go for zombies. They are both living in some way and they are dead. And you can have fun with thinking about many different monsters and what are the ways in which they seem to defy or blur natural categories in which we put various kinds of living things and objects. So that is a kind of popular theory of disgust. Now, and I give you this because the way in which Eugenie Brinkema, in her article on disgust, approaches disgust is very, very different. What she does in this chapter that I assigned, she takes this question, why do we feel disgust? And she says, I don't care about it. Indeed, she does care about it in another chapter, but in this chapter, she's not so much answering the question, why? She's answering the question, what is it like to feel disgust? And why is this different? What's the significance of saying there's a distinction between why do we feel disgust as a question and what is it like to feel disgust? I think there's a big difference between these two things. And the difference I like to kind of, in my jargony philosophy way, say it's moving from an ontology of disgust to a phenomenology of disgust. That's a fancy way of saying we're moving from what is the nature of thing X to what is it like to experience thing X. The great thing about phenomenology as a discipline, and we talked about this in my other video on this very topic, is that you don't have to answer the big questions of what is the nature of and where does X come from. All you have to do is get closer to the thing by describing an experience of it, an experience that seems structural, an experience that seems like it would be shared by many, many other people. And really, that's what she's doing here. And I'll show you that's what she's doing here, because largely what she's doing in her account of disgust is she's borrowing from this philosopher named Aurel Colnay, who she describes as a phenomenologist. She writes a small treatise written in 1927 by an Austrian phenomenologist, which is motivated by a descriptive phenomenological approach. Remember, I also established that phenomenology as a philosophical discipline and as a subset of film studies is all about very, very close and nuanced and almost absurdly specific description of stuff. And not a description that is scientific and that it's like measuring things and finding out what they're made of, but just sticking to the surface of things, the appearance of things, or what it is like to feel a particular feeling. That's the phenomenological approach. So, she begins her account of Colnay's account by quoting him. He says, disgust is more aesthetically determined than is fear. Now, what the heck does that mean? Now, she actually will help us understand what this means when she clarifies. Aesthetics as Kolnai employs the term, refers to a relation to the features or qualities of an object. What we can do then is take this sentence from Kolnai and then begin to tease out the relationship between disgust and fear as a means of understanding this rather complicated and philosophical account of what disgust is. So what is the difference between fear and disgust? I mean, this is a great question because all of us have felt these things in our whole lives, right? They're ordinary things. Children, even if they don't know the difference between these two things, have experienced these two things. And I bet you would get a lot out of a child by asking them what one thing is like as opposed to the other. And this is kind of like what phenomenology is, right? Taking these things that we take for granted and then really asking you to try to abstract the conditions for something that's so close to us that we have a hard time defining it. So fear versus disgust. What's going on between these two emotions? Here's what Kolnai says. And when I say Kolnai, I always mean Brinkema doing the account of Kolnai. So fear is toward the being as such of the object feared, that it exists in its existence, and the self experienced as being threatened. Okay, maybe that sounds confusing for right now, but just keep that in your mind. Disgust, on the other hand, is concerned more with the minutia of the object. Let's expand. Fear is of the fact that something is, that the monster in my closet exists in its existential isness, while disgust is of the being so, that something is in its likeness, the sliminess of the miscreation surface, the wetness of its oozing sores, and the foulness of its odor. Furthermore, disgust is bound not to an object, but to its adjectives. So how do I do my job of expanding upon these maybe confusing distinctions? So let's develop the account. What does it really mean? So I've Googled disgust and fear, and I want to take a couple images from both to try to elaborate on these definitions. So here's my fearful face. Here's my fearful child. Fear is of the fact that something is, that the monster in my closet exists in its existential isness. Here's what I'm gathering from what Brinkema means by this. When you are fearful, you are not necessarily concerned with the surface qualities of the thing, nor do you have the time to apprehend the surface qualities of the thing that scares you. Look at the child here. The child has his hands over his face because he is already afraid of the thing that he might not even be seeing. And the thing that he's afraid of, if we're thinking of the stereotypical child afraid of the monster in their closet, is not something that he has a perceptual account of at all. He's afraid of the existence of something, anything lurking in his room. He does not need, in a sense, or does not have the luxury of apprehending its superficial qualities. He's already afraid just of something being there and threatening his own existence. Think about that. Now think about the disgusted face. When I look at this face, I immediately recognize that it's disgusted, but I don't imagine that it would react to the same kind of thing that the child afraid of the monster in his closet would be reacting to. So read this definition from Brinkema once again. While disgust is of the being so, that something is in its likeness, the sliminess of the surface, the wetness of its oozing sores, and the foulness of its odor. Notice when we have this particular face, we realize that only that face is the result of an aesthetic encounter with the superficial qualities of the thing, right? You're not afraid of the thing that disgusts you. You have to had apprehended its very particular qualities. That's the difference between one being the result of an aesthetic encounter and one being the result of something that precedes aesthetics in a way. You don't have the time to apprehend its sensory qualities when you're fearful of the thing, right? When a buffalo is charging at you, right? You're not afraid of the fluffiness of its fur. You're afraid of it as a thing charging you and threatening your safety. And I have a rather crude example of this. But so actually what I have here is an image not of feces, but of a plastic representation of feces used as a gag gift. But I still think that this illustrates my point. So I'm going to say, to clarify Eugenie Brinkema's point, that disgust is not a recoiling at the fact of poop. Okay, bear with me. I know this sounds absurd. Disgust is not a recoiling at the fact of poop. This is me talking here, not Brinkema. It's a visceral and sustained reaction to an aesthetic encounter with this poop. I hope you see the difference between our understanding of the nature of a thing, say feces, and what it means to encounter this particular object of feces in its sensuous particularity, the kind of qualities of the feces that disgust us. This, I surmise, is one of the reasons that abstractions of disgusting things, or the things that we tend to think of disgusting, like cartoon versions of them, are often not very disgusting. I immediately thought of this cartoon book that I had in my house as a child called Everybody Poops. It is a real book. It is for children, and but the cartoon renderings of what we consider to be a rather disgusting act don't seem all that disgusting to me. And I think that's partly because they are rendering just enough of the disgusting thing to get us to recognize the disgusting thing without reproducing the particular hyper-particular qualities of the thing that make us disgusting. Think if you had a photograph of actual feces, that level of detail disgusts us, just like this gag gift, right? The plastic poo thing that you buy why is it disgusting? Why does it work as a gag gift? Because it's aspiring for a hyper-realism. Right? It's not wet, but it looks wet because it was made to create a glistening surface as if it were wet. And the wetness certainly is a quality of the thing that we kind of recoil at. And the wetness creates a sense that something would have more of a smell than if it were, say, dry, right? I don't know why I associate the wetness with the smell, but I do, and I bet you do too. Like, that's my phenomenology of my disgust at this particular kind of thing. You see the difference here, right? Neither of these things is the thing, but one of them tries to approximate its particularity. The other thing doesn't, and that's what makes this thing not disgusting, right? And that's why disgust is about the particularities that are the result of an aesthetic encounter. So just as a nod to the second part of this video, which I have not made yet, how would I elaborate this distinction in movies? Well, think about, what do we think of as scary or fearful in movies, particularly like slasher horror films? I'll tell you what scares me: jump scares. And now, some people might say that jump scares are not fearful-inducing, or not fear-inducing things, but surprise-inducing things. Well, if you watch enough horror movies, you figure out when a jump scare is going to happen, right? And so the surprise isn't so much a genuine or complete surprise as it is fear and surprise mixed together. So that moment when we feel that it's just too quiet and the frame is going to be filled at some moment, that we are just burgeoning with fear. There is now disgust, which sometimes is a goal of slasher horror films, but is more so the kind of ultimate goal of what you might call body horror films. Anyone's a fan of David Cronenberg movies knows exactly what I'm talking about, and this is a gift from Cronenberg. This is also a Nightmare on Elm Street film. This is rather different. And remember that Brinkema says that disgusting things in cinema are often associated with the close-up. And the close-up is associated with giving us details, right? If I told you about this procedure, if I simply said that that skin was being kind of carefully removed from the body, the more that I described it, the more you would probably become disgusted, right? And it's the nature of this image, the slow peeling of the skin in a way that doesn't feel right for skin to be this malleable, right? The fact that I can see the glistening right here, that is that makes me recognize that liquid as blood. That is what I find disgusting. It has to be a slow aesthetic encounter. Here, my fear happens way before the monster appears, right? That's the difference, I think, between disgust. Hyper particular aesthetic encounter. Here, most of the fear comes from my imagination of what is lurking around the corner. I fear the existence of something ruining my quiet contemplative mode, right? Here are the distinctions once again. So why does this matter to Brinkema? I think it's enough that she introduces this very interesting account of disgust that I find way more satisfying than Noel Carroll or Mary Douglas or an evolutionary biologist. It's not the end goal, right? Why does this matter to Brinkema? She has this theory that this theory of disgust has something to do with aesthetics and reading and doing criticism of movies. That's a wild thing to say, but here's the connection that she makes. She says, disgust involves a duration of interpretation toward the qualities of an object, a hesitating encounter with distinct features. In other words, there's something about the experience of disgust, given Kolnai's reading of it, that is similar to the act of criticism, of art criticism, if art criticism is something that emerges from a close, detailed aesthetic encounter with the formal qualities of a thing. That's like the first thing that she says. And she means this to be rather surprising and counterintuitive. And she continues to elaborate on what her point is. If reading for form involves attending to what cannot be paraphrased, in other words, necessitates tarrying with the specificities of any text, reading for disgust likewise cannot be accomplished through an a priori attribution of essential disgusting things already in the world. To put this in its strongest formulation, Kolnai's argument that disgust is aesthetic because it involves intentionality toward the qualities of an object suggests that disgust, in fact, requires reading for the unleashed details in the form of any film. So once again, she is trying to compete against theories of disgust that that define disgust by the kinds of objects that tend to disgust us, right? Remember the evolutionary biologist. For that person, it's really important that, say, feces is a universal disgusting thing because it is also harmful to us if we ingest it. But Brinkema wants to say, do not say that disgust is a result of apprehending some essence of a thing. Say that thing X is harmful to us. No, she wants to say that every instance of disgust is a specific aesthetic encounter with that particular thing, how the light hits it, how it glistens, how the wind hits it and it wafts into your nasal passages. That moment of being disgust is singular, and so is the object that caused it, and that kind of encounter is like what it means to apprehend a work of art, which also is a singular thing, right? This Jackson Pollock painting is different from every other Jackson Pollock painting. The cook, the thief, the wife, her lover is what it is because of every single camera movement, every single color scheme, every little gesture made by the actor, every sound, every note of the score, all put together into a hyper-particular object that we understand as a unique art object. That is the connection that she wants to draw between disgust and the aesthetic as a category. So that's where I'm ending this. I'll see you next time.